Today I will show you what young women look like in different countries. Young woman in Cuba. Young woman in USA. Young woman in Germany. Young woman in France. Young woman in Sri Lanka. Young woman in Australia. Young woman in Korea. Young woman in Great Britain. Young woman in Italy. Young woman in Belgium. Young woman in Poland. Young woman in Austria. Young woman in Denmark. Young woman in Colombia. Young woman in Czech. Young woman in Namibia. Young woman in Mexico. Young woman in Turkey. Young woman in Brazil. Young woman in Greece. Young woman in Spain. Young woman in India. Young woman in Chile. Young woman in Japan. Young woman in Georgia. Young woman in Netherlands. Young woman in Maldives. Young woman in Morocco. Young woman in Thailand. Young woman in Portugal. Young woman in Singapore. Young woman in Zimbabwe. Young woman in Canada. Young woman in Finland. Young woman in Egypt. Young woman in Russia. Young woman in Israel. Young woman in Hungary. Young woman in Argentina. Young woman in Albania. Young woman in Indonesia. Young woman in Monaco. Young woman in New Zealand. Young woman in Sweden. Young woman in Ukraine. Young woman in Pakistan. Young woman in Switzerland. Young woman in Dominica. Young woman in Ireland. Young woman in Norway. Young woman in UAE. Young woman in China. Young woman in Algeria. Young woman in Bahamas. Young woman in Bangladesh. Young woman in Barbados. Young woman in Haiti. Young woman in Guatemala. Young woman in Honduras. Young woman in Iran. Young woman in Iraq. Young woman in Jordan. Young woman in Cambodia. Young woman in Kenya. Young woman in Latvia. Young woman in Lebanon. Young woman in Madagascar. Young woman in Nigeria. Young woman in Seychelles. Young woman in Slovakia. Young woman in Slovenia. Young woman in Uganda. Young woman in Philippines. Young woman in Uruguay. Young woman in Ethiopia.
Write in the comments what to show you in the next video.